So I would like to thank, first of all, we're delighted to have this wonderful panel with us today. And so I would like to welcome our panelists. I would like also to thank their staff, really, for supporting the advanced work around this event. You know, there are more than 100 side events during these few days of this summit, and we're very happy that we have a full house. So I would like to welcome the audience too. I would like also to welcome our internet audience, because this is globally, this is a webcast globally. And we have also a Twitter handle, which is #AfricaSummit. And we will take questions from Twitter, from the internet, and also, of course, from the audience. So why are we having this panel? So the theme is charting a new economic future. So it is clear that for this Africa Summit, African leaders are not coming with a hat in their hand, but rather they have identified a number of priorities and looking for the American business sector to play a big role into really addressing those priorities. So if you take the last 20 years, 9 out of the 20 fastest growing economies in the world were from Africa, right? No matter how you define a middle class, whether it's $2 of spending a day or more, it is clear that Africa is having a vibrant middle class which is growing very fast. But yet, Africa is urbanizing very quickly, and we have a youth which is urbanized and often without a job. And Congressman Smith, in the previous panel, had this wonderful quote. He said, "The best anti-poverty program ever has always been a job." So we have this very fast growth, but we're also facing a number of challenges, including a jobless growth, including lack of infrastructure, 600 million of Africans without access to electricity. So this growth, as Nobel Prize Joe Stiglitz said in his recent Financial Times article on the summit, this growth has not generated enough formal sector employment to absorb the growing labor force. So we have a number of questions. What challenges and opportunities are shaping Africa's economic landscape? How are entrepreneurship and innovation being leveraged to promote inclusive economic development? Is the US taking full advantage of the opportunities to create mutual prosperity with African countries? And what role can the US play to support African economies as they attempt to reach their full economic potential? And we have a wonderful panel here to answer those questions, as well as your questions. So if you allow me, I would like now to introduce the panelists, starting with Dr. Donald Kaberuka on my left. Mr. Kaberuka is currently serving his second 5-year term as president of the African Development Bank, which is moving, by the way, from Tunis to Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, where it was originally. Mr. Kaberuka has a distinguished career in banking, international trade and development, and government service. He served as the Minister of Finance of Rwanda, where I had the pleasure to meet him as part of an IMF mission looking at the financial sector in Rwanda. He initiated and implemented major economic reforms and introduced new systems of structural, monetary, and fiscal governance. And these reforms are in no doubt part of the widely recognized revival of Rwanda's economy that we see today. So at the African Development Bank, Mr. Kaberuka has placed increased emphasis on the private sector and on the importance of major infrastructure developments. Next is Ms. Caroline Campbell, who is a managing director founding partner and general counsel of Emerging Capital Partners, ECP. If you follow private equity in Africa, you have to know ECP, right? So she's based here in Washington, D.C., and is part of the management of 7 funds and over $2 billion US dollars under management. And ECP is one of the leading private equity managers focused on Africa. And ECP has about 7 offices across the continent and over a decade of investing experience in a number of investments. Before that, Ms. Campbell was a senior associate at White & Case, LLP, in the firm's Warsaw, London, and Washington, D.C. office. She was also an associate professor at George Washington University National Law Center, lecturing on international negotiations. Then Mr. Mo Ibrahim, who does not need maybe a lot of introduction, but we all know the foundation he's chairing and he's created in 2006. This Mo Ibrahim Foundation supports good governance and exceptional leadership on the African continent. Dr. Ibrahim was born in Sudan, and he's a global expert in mobile communications with a distinguished business career. And he's also the founder of Celtel International, who, it is very interesting because some of the first South-South investment we've seen included Celtel, which was sold to Zain in 2005 and then purchased by Bharti Airtel in 2010. He is listed by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. Last but not least, we have Jason Joku, who is CEO and co-founder of Iroko TV. That's how we pronounce it in Nigeria, although it's Iroko here. So he graduated from the University of Manchester in 2005 with a chemistry degree. And after 9 failed business attempts in the world of online media, he moved back home with his mom at the age of 29. And back home, he observed that his mom loved watching Nollywood movies and had the idea to look for a reliable source of films online, which he could not find, so he created his own company. So this company now is YouTube's largest partner in Africa. And in 2012, recently the site has recorded over 1 million plus registered users and about 14 million hours of movies. So my colleague was reminding me that in the internet business, failure is a badge of pride. So imagine him with 9 medals. You get the picture. So let me then have the panelists each have 7 minutes of their remarks before we open the session to Q&A. Thanks. So, Dr. So I called you Donald, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
I'm sure at the African Development Bank, not many people have that privilege.
You know quite a lot. Thanks, Amadou. Well, I'm a bit of an outlier on this panel. These are incredibly successful business persons, and I'm just a bureaucrat who works for the African Development Bank, so I have to be careful what I say in front of these people. But here, just 3 things I want to share with you in relation to this summit. If this summit was taking place 10 years ago, the chances are the conversation would be quite different. It would be about what can we do for Africa? Sometimes even without their views being taken into consideration. It would be how can we help this continent of despair? It would be about debt. It's about doubling aid, as was the case at Gleneagles. So that would have been the conversation then. Now, a lot of water has gone under the bridge since, Now, this is a conversation about trade, growth, and investment. So I do think that that change in narrative itself is extremely important, both for the US and for Africa. But in between, what has changed then? In between, the world has changed enormously. Africa now has many more partners than they had in the past, including many in the emerging markets. The world trade has changed. It's no longer about exporting commodities, exporting made-in products. It's about value chains. It's about trade in tasks, as we economists like to call it. And so Africa, which used to be looked at as a continent which exports things, products, is now challenging to get into the global value chains at the higher levels on the ladder. But third, Africa too has changed internally quite dramatically. Not simply the demographic dynamics of which you are familiar, but also in terms of how we view the state, the private markets, and how the two work together to create wealth. But Africa has changed too in terms of these high numbers of economic growth, which everybody is familiar with. However, as I was saying this morning at the AGOA summit, the story ends there. Strong economic growth is an essential condition for a takeoff, but it's only that. Economic growth that does not translate into economic transformation exactly has those problems you described: jobs, opportunities. So the challenges for our continent is now how to go from economic growth to economic transformation. What does it take? Of course, we could have been grown faster, not 6.2%, maybe 8, 9, if there was adequate infrastructure. But even then, it would not take away the challenge of going from economic growth to economic transformation. So the kind of conversation I would like to see in this space, as we speak to our American friends, European friends, and many others, is this a challenge we are facing, all of us? And I believe that if we can make that jump, a prosperous Africa would be exactly what the world today needs to get out of this slow growth and recession. Just before I conclude, just think in the aftermath of the global economic crisis in 2008, if there was no China, no India, no Brazil, no large emerging markets to hold the economy, I think this crisis would have been much deeper. But now think if Africa had been an additional platform of growth, if we have been able to overcome those challenges I'm mentioning. So I believe that our leaders who are here, our business people, were looking for opportunities to engage in that second stage, which is to transform our continent, not simply growing the economy, growing the GDP. Because as your colleagues in Senegal like to say, you don't eat GDP, you know that. Yeah, you have to go from the GDP numbers to actually transform the economy, creating jobs, and that's the challenge you have today.
Thank you. So, global value chains, economic transformation. So these are two of the key themes. We will come back during the Q&A. So, Caroline?
Yes, so as Amadou mentioned, ECP is a private equity fund manager, and we started in 2000. Many of you will remember that year as the year that Africa was featured on the cover of The Economist as the lost continent. So we had a very hard time raising money. Everybody doubted we would invest the money, and then they really doubted that we would ever exit our investments. I am in great company here today because the African Development Bank helped seed us in that year. They believed in the mission that private sector investment could make private sector returns in an honest, transparent way. And one of our first companies that we invested in was Mo's Celtel. So I think on the two sides, you pretty much proved the thesis. We went on to invest in over 55 companies since then. We've had over 33 exits, and our companies operate in 45 countries across the continent. We cover both the Anglophone and the Francophone side of the continent. We do not focus on SMEs. They are a very important part of Africa. They contribute to 1% of GDP typically. We are focusing on larger investments. Our thesis is that that's where you're generating the great job growth. And we look, across our portfolio at what we do. It's tens of thousands of jobs that are created by the sector on which we focus. We used to be based in DC. That was based on the year of creation. We have gone on, though, to push most of our investment professionals and our investing operations onto the continent, as Amadou mentioned. And that has been, we've never closed an office. We've only had growth into all of our offices, which span the entire perimeter of the continent. And we're seeing that in the beginning it was mostly telecom. We added on financial services, and now we are moving into consumer-facing industries because that is where the growth is being generated, and all of these sectors are interrelated. Before we get too excited about this, however, private equity accounts for about 0.1% of investment into Africa. And as great as we're going to sound by the end of this panel, and as great as our accomplishments are, the real need is in the very traditional infrastructure sector. And I'm sure we have many economists in the room. I don't need to remind you, but after World War II, the investment in infrastructure as a percentage of GDP was 8 to 9% in Germany and Japan. It is currently 6 to 7% in China and India. It is 2 to 3% in Europe and the US, and it's less than 2% in Africa. Infrastructure is the backbone of what we do. It will eventually be the backbone of growth, and there we're talking about energy and ICT, information and telecommunications. We are making investments in both those sectors. We do run a utility platform company out of Ivory Coast, and we are helping, but we're, one could say, an important drop in the bucket. So that's the real story. Touching on three of the themes of today's conference that are particularly near and dear to us. One is governance. Africa is quite lucky in this regard. The governance bar is high. It's high globally post-2008. It's even higher for Africa. You just mentioned Africa in the developed markets as we try to raise money and everybody's eyes open wide. But Africa also is very lucky because it's played leapfrog. Because there's been such an intense focus on it, it's always put these best practices into all of our investments from the beginning. Our endeared investors have always insisted that these controls and checks be put in place. And we're trying to build sustainable companies that we can sell ultimately. And it's just not sellable to have a company that's not completely running along the lines of the very best governance practices globally. Looking at some of the indices worldwide, Transparency International, Africa rates fairly highly. It's 14 of the countries rate more strongly than India, and 35 of them rate above Russia. So I think that the governance question is largely answered. Mo Ibrahim's foundation has its own index called the Ibrahim Index. And of that, his index notes, if you go online today, that 70% of African countries have improved since 2006. So the governance story is not a weakness, it's a strength for Africa, and it's one that helps everybody. It helps us, it helps the continent, and it should help everybody want to invest more and more there. The second topic of the panel is security, and there again, the perceived risk outweighs largely the actual risk on the ground. If you assess risk and if you put in place different mechanisms to mitigate against any risk, the risk-reward return equation is very favorable for Africa as well. We have been through elections in Nigeria in 2008, in Ghana in 2012, in Kenya in 2007, and even in 2010 in Ivory Coast. We ran the country's electricity and water utilities through the civil war and came out the other side very well, as attested by the fact that the African Development Bank is relocating to Abidjan so quickly after the crisis. That is a great vote of confidence, and we didn't even evacuate our office there. We haven't evacuated our offices anywhere. And finally, a word about job creation and poverty reduction. Amadou said it very well. You know, you want to reduce poverty, create jobs. I think this entire panel, it's probably safe to say, is pretty much, you're speaking to the converted here. We've seen it. This is what happens. We did a study of one of our businesses in East Africa, which is a repeatable box, sort of a Starbucks type of business that we're rolling out. It's growing extremely fast based on the growth of the middle class in the East Africa region. And CDC did a study for us of our employment multiplier effect, and for every job we created, 3 family members were provided for. And looking across the training programs that our companies provide, and it's nearly all of our companies that provide training programs. You train one person at any level, and the training spreads to other parts of the organization, and that's true for governance as well. So I will leave it there.
Thanks, Caroline. I think it's very interesting that those statistics regarding the governance indicators are probably not what most people would have thought about when it comes to Africa. As we're comparing Africa to Russia and India and saying that Africa fares well when it comes to governance. But we have the governance expert, Mo, who's going to tell us about governance and other issues.
Right. Good evening, everybody, or good afternoon. Is there any way to dim this bright lights?
It's difficult.
You should have warned us to bring
Can't see my
sunglasses
notes.
or something.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. Governance in Africa. I mean, to start with, why governance? I just happen to believe that really governance is a basis for development. It's a basis for every good thing. Without good governance, really, we cannot move forward. And one of the main problem we had over the last 40 years or so since independence was that in many cases there was failure in governance, there was misrule. And that resulted really in a catastrophic regression in Africa. 40 or 50 years ago, a number of African countries had better income per head than China, than South Korea, than Singapore, than Malaysia, etc. And that has been reversed very badly, actually, over a number of years. And there is no really material reason for that. There is no objective reason for that, because Africa is a huge continent, and it has its fair share of resources. There are not many African people. African people, all of them, are less than India, are less than China. While Africa itself, you can put geographically China, you can put India, you can put United States, you can put all of Europe, and it still will be some empty spaces. That is the size, actually, of Africa. So there's no material or really good reasons for us to really lag behind over the last 40 or 50 years. And in my view and view of my colleagues, it's a failure of our leadership to manage our resources, material resources and human resources, organizing society, etc. That is the piece really which caused a lot of issues. That's why when I finished with business and you know, we were fortunate to make some money and who made this lady rich. Then we said, okay, it's time to do business, it's time to do other things. And I thought, what is the best thing to do really is to try to help. Charity is wonderful, but it does not change the fate of people. You know, you feed people today, you need to feed them tomorrow, you need to feed them the day after. But what we need is to change the reason why they need to be fed or need to be helped. And that's why we decided to work in that space. which is governance and how to improve governance in Africa. And our view, governance is not an emotional term, or it's not, governance is measurable. It is about that basket of deliverables any government needs to deliver to its own people. It's about security, safety, it's about rule of law, it's about human rights, about economic development, about infrastructure, about education, access to health, access to schools. These are all the kind of deliverables people need. It is also about gender issues. I mean, how do, and we have some problems about that in Africa, or certain parts of Africa. So we set out really to produce really a measurement of all these parameters. We measure about 130 parameters, and we publish that every year. The objective here is really to measure accurately where we are every year and where are we moving, what strengths, what weaknesses, what works, what doesn't work. It's something to help the governments, it helps civil society, because we can have a reasonable conversation based on data and facts, not about slogan and shouting or dancing or whatever, but really facts, data. How many kilometers of road last year have been paved? How many schools have been opened? What sort of inflation? What sort of deficit? What is the public debt? What about corruption? What about human rights? How many people are in prisons? How many? All this kind of information give us a picture about what's going on here. In short, it's about really building institutions capability in the country, which really ensure the long and stable development of that place. So that's what we're trying to do with the index. The good news is that last year in our report, we have data now for about 10 years, and we thought let us compare the data over 10 years, what happened exactly in Africa. And that was very interesting because we noticed, of course, economically, Africa moved quite ahead. The average growth per year all over Africa the last decade was about 5.6 or 5.7%, which is great, given some difficulties were during this period of time worldwide. Health improved, education improved a lot, so there are a lot of good improvement. Gender issues improved a lot, 37% improvement. They are very high improvement, although it's coming from a very low base. So it's too soon to pat ourselves in the back because we're still very much behind in that area. In general, the good news was 94% of the African people live today in a much better governed society than 10 years ago. So that's good news. The job is not done. Still we have a lot of issues in Africa. Still we have a lot of conflicts. We noticed also last year in our report that while external conflicts have almost vanished in Africa, what we have seen now, the rise of internal conflicts. We see a lot of internal conflicts now taking place in Africa, and that we raised that as a red flag last year, and I think the situation is getting worse, and we need to see why this is happening. Is it an ethnic problem? Is it a religious problem? Is it an inequality problem? Or is it these three problems together which are causing these issues? But that is a dangerous trend, don't have to be really dealt with accordingly. I guess I stop here to not over.
Thank you, Mo. I have to add that the Mo Ibrahim Foundation just released a very, very informative report on regional integration, regional economic integration. I encourage you to have a look. It's very well made. Last but not least, the theme of the U.S. Africa's Leaders Summit is investing in future generation. I cannot believe that I can say that, but anyways, so I thought I was much younger, but anyways. We have here Jason, who can tell us about, first of all, entrepreneurship and the role of the youth into really taking things on their own hands and making it happen in a very difficult environment. So Jason?
Cool, thank you. So thank you for having me. I'm basically going to walk through the opportunities, entrepreneurs, and obviously the changing consumer trends that I see in Nigeria. So I'm an internet entrepreneur. If you look globally, there has been hundreds of billions of dollars of value created from internet industries, but in Africa, nothing has really been created yet. When you think of internet, you think of typically like very young people doing sort of like trivial things online, but with a 600 million person population under the age of 35, that gives you some indication of what is possible with a very young, connected, and essentially mobile and tech-savvy audience. I look at my experiences, so it was touched upon that Iroko was my 10th venture. I was born and bred in the UK. I was almost a broken entrepreneur in 2010 when I decided it was time for me to try something new. Jumped on a plane, moved back to Nigeria. Nigeria has some of the most hostile, like for young entrepreneurs, operating sort of places. So from electricity, from predatory bureaucrats, to obviously corruption and just being able to kind of like find the right people. Very, very discouraging if you just look at the problems, but if you actually look at the opportunities, the world changes it, but especially with someone who has nothing to lose. And I think with the mass unemployment problem currently in Nigeria, a lot of people have like a side hustle. I was talking to someone yesterday and they said how Nigerians here even in the States, they never have like one job, they always have something else to do on the side. So in terms of sort of having sort of a side sort of hustle, that Nigerians are typically known for that. So if you have a mass of young people who are mobile, who are connected, they're always typically finding things to do. So in 2010, when I moved back to Nigeria, my thought was really simple. There was an entire movie industry out there. Let me simply attempt to digitize it. Strangely enough, no one had ever thought to ever legally do this before. And this is an industry which, at the time I landed, I think the Guardian sort of said it was about £300 million in terms of like value. It had never been digitized. No one ever sort of like wrapped any kind of legal framework around the licensing, the distribution, the copyright aspects. So I wandered in there, again, having no previous experience in law, in media, or anything. I just thought, let me just explore this. What I found very quickly was there was this homegrown passion for sort of local stories. I think gone are the days when, especially Nigeria consumes from outside, it typically wants to consume its own content. It wants to hear music from people who speak different tongues or local tongues to them. They want to watch movies with people who have their own names, as exotic as they can be, even better. So in digitizing that, I realized there was like a massive opportunity there. Very quickly, it was sort of noted upon that we would actually do something quite interesting. So having never created a business plan, never created a pitch deck, never created anything, we were fortunate enough to have received a lot of inbound interest from like venture capitalists. And these are like bleeding edge emerging market venture capitalists. So if you think Tiger Global, based out of New York, and Shinivik, which are in telecoms and sort of TMT investments globally. We raised like $21 million over the last 2.5 years. It's gone from me sitting in a room in Lagos, struggling to pay for electricity, to offices in New York. We have an office in Lagos, Johannesburg, and we just opened up an office in Kigali. And again, this essentially all happened in the last 2.5 years. What the interesting thing from my perspective, obviously, was that from an entrepreneur, there were all these opportunities there, but the future of entrepreneurship has to be financed somehow. There is no version of internet economies anywhere in the world which hasn't been significantly additionally invested in by like venture capitalists. So last year, in 2013, there was about $70 to $80 million, which went into like Nigerian internet companies, of which pretty much all of those internet companies were created in the last 3 years. That pales in comparison to India, where one company just last week raised $1 billion as part of like a broader investment raise of sort of like $1.7 billion or something. So in terms of creating that future, it has to be financed. So, what I try to do obviously is sex up the story of Nigerian internet, make it that much more attractive because it is attractive. The fundamental demographics are there. Who would have thought 15 years ago that Nigeria will be the largest, contributor to telecoms in Africa in terms of profits for MTN? If you remove Nigeria, they don't really have very much, I would say. I think it's also really important that everywhere you look in terms of internet investments, there is a peculiar economics which works just for internet companies, but over time they actually show a significant amount of value. If you think in 2001, the first wave of mega Chinese internet companies were created. So you think of the Alibabas, you think of the Tencents, those companies are now going to be worth like at least $100 billion each comfortably. So the perspective is today that we are in a unique period of time where the companies which will be created, that by 2020 we'll be talking about sort of billion-dollar listings on the NASDAQ and such. Again, we're literally like the first meter in like at least a sort of 1,000-meter race, but hopefully, obviously with more awareness, that will definitely get there. And I think in terms of consumers changing, I think if you have a young population, they're mobile, they're definitely engaged on social media. You actually have the unique opportunity to actually realign how business is done in a lot of these previously opaque economies. So if you take Nigeria, for instance, it will be with social media, it's very, very difficult to rig an election in Nigeria if anyone tried to do so, because there is someone snapping and tweeting and engaging in that way. I think never before have Nigerian officials been held to account, and any of the kind of propaganda-esque type of communications being called into question and sort of disputed quite openly on a constant basis. What typically used to happen was terrestrial TV or newspapers acted as almost like the Ministry of Information for the government. So the streets could be burning in the north, but on the national television networks, they sort of be showing happy children and dancing in the streets and stuff like that. So I think with social media, you then start to become much more accountable basically as a country. And I think more accountability, especially around some of the more devious practices on a day-to-day basis, makes just operating environments just easier for investors and obviously for like entrepreneurs there as well.
Yeah, but thank you. That's a very interesting theme of having social media helping when it comes to governance and also helping when it comes to transforming the economy. So I'll just now move to a very maybe 4 quick questions before opening it up to the audience. We are in the U.S. This is the 44th U.S. president, first U.S. Leaders Summit. If I'm a U.S. businessman from, let's say, Little Rock, Arkansas, where President Clinton comes from, what's in it for me? I mean, I have this image from Africa, which is most often about diseases, destruction, and so on. How do I make it happen? How do I have a better sense of what's happening as a return? By the way, most of the studies we've seen say that the highest return on foreign direct investment are in Africa. So I'll give that to you. Maybe second question quickly, or maybe I'll let you finish and then I'll move to the other questions. Maybe that's better.
But I think the question you're asking is the old type of questions.
Yeah.
Is Africa of disease, of hunger, of these problems. And I think many people would disagree with that. The proof, what we just mentioned, came to us, we provided funding, and you're prospering. I think we have done 2 or 3 times. We do, in the bank, we do about $3 billion of funding to private businesses, including American business people. And non-performing loans to date are less than 2%, right? Many American companies. In fact, just before coming here, I was visiting a country where, not Nigeria, by the way, they take gas, they transform it into methanol, LPG, LNG, and this is an American company. And they've been doing this for 5 years. And they've got 14% of the American market on methanol. So I believe that people who are there doing business, they can assess Africa's risks. They do in Ukraine, in Sri Lanka, in Colombia, in Latin America. Africa is no different. If you're looking for problems, you'll find them. If you're looking for things which work, you'll find them. If you're looking for ways to mitigate for those risks and to price them into what you do, we can help you do it. So I think, yes, there was an asymmetry of information at some points. I think that is getting closer and closer. I do believe that there's a difference between people already investing on my continent and those who are yet to invest. And so those who are investing there already know that the risks are no different from elsewhere. So I don't want this person from Arkansas, Little Rock, Arkansas, or is different from those who are coming from Shanghai, or coming from Istanbul, or coming from the south of India. So it's an opportunity open for American business people. It's an opportunity for which they have to compete with others, by the way. Bear in mind that now it's a competitive place, so you have to compete. And I do believe that those who still have an asymmetry of knowledge, P's like my colleague here, the bank, we can help them close that gap of information. But there are opportunities. Now, as my friend Ngozi says, they can choose to wait, and others will be moving on.
Yes, so I might say we've looked at these issues, and there are some areas where the U.S. has a huge comparative advantage. Let's take education. In your hometown of Kigali, Carnegie Mellon has opened a master's program, and I can tell you that U.S. universities will have a comparative advantage in the continent. That's for sure. And we've seen the Walmarts, the GEs, and the IBMs, and Microsoft, and so on in Africa.
But we funded that Carnegie Mellon.
Oh, I didn't know.
So Carnegie Mellon sent their campus to Kigali. We funded it. Rwanda and other East African kids are learning IT there. So it's working for all parties.
Yeah. So then coming back to this financing theme, I want to move to the private equity business, because there's a lot of perception about governance in Africa, and it seems that private equity, given its arm's length type of structure, monitoring, being on the board, and being involved almost sometimes on a daily basis, is kind of a good fit when it comes to investing in Africa. But at the same time, typically, it's my understanding that private equity investors are looking for an exit. But then you have shallow capital markets, apart from South Africa, and to some extent Nairobi and Nigeria. So is the future of private equity in Africa just to be permanently private equity investors? And the second quick question is, we've mentioned a few sectors here, but from where you sit, being a private equity investor, what are the sectors for the future?
Great questions. On the first point, it's interesting, another African PE difference to other regions of the world, including the developed world, is African private equity is not LBOs, where you come into a company, you lever it up with a bunch of debt, fire all the employees, list, and you've made 20 times your money. That is not what we're doing. It's called growth private equity. So you're helping a company, and a lot of companies in Africa are family companies, or closely held, or they have a great concept like Jason's company, but they can't get to the next level. So we come in and we provide capital because the capital markets are very thin. The banks are lending to often just a few corporates or family groups, and companies like Jason's don't have access to capital. So we come in, enter the private equity, which is a lot like venture capital, but at a little later stage of development of most of our companies. And we put the equity in, so we're now co-owners of the company. The entrepreneurs have to get comfortable with that. They've been managing their companies as a family affair perhaps for a while, but now we're on the books as an owner of the company, and we are liable for anything that goes wrong, and it's our reputation in with the company, so we have to vet the entrepreneur pretty carefully. But once there's that alignment, we provide really close support. Once they have more equity on their balance sheet, they could add a little more debt. In Africa, the levels are a third or a half. For every dollar of equity, you might get, 25 cents to 30 cents of debt. It's not the other way around. It's not leverage ratios that we think of here. So we are growth capital. And then we help those businesses define their strategy and implement it. We are all over them on the governance. You know, they have to have board practices and reporting and financial reporting and transparency, because our investors have to see these reports, and they want to see them on a very timely basis all throughout the year. And then, as I mentioned, when we go to sell the companies, they have to look crystal clean, because the bar is very high in Africa. No one's buying a dirty African company, just like they wouldn't buy a dirty Chinese company. And the world's only going one direction in this regards, with FATCA and all the new transparency on banking and sourcing of funds and who's paying whom. And I really think the days of Switzerland type situations are numbered. But so suffice it to say, for Africa, this is the role that private equity plays. And the second part of your question?
Yeah, so what's...
okay, the timing, yes. We're in the long range of financing. I mentioned there's a huge deficit that will need to be played by debt for huge infrastructure projects. They don't have the returns that our investors require in order to take the risk to make an investment in Africa. They're also just too huge. They require billions of dollars, tens or hundreds of billions of dollars. So what we do, though, is when we exit a company, we bring in a new source of financing is brought to bear in Africa. And if you look at exits in Africa versus the rest of the world, it used to look a lot like exits from private investments in Europe. You know, a third a trade sale, a third sale to a financial investor or back to the owner, and then a third an IPO, something like that. And another interesting tidbit here on Africa is that, unlike other emerging markets, when you look at exit patterns out of private equity investments, in Africa, we have about the same amount of trade sales as China or Brazil, but we have more IPO and more like a structured sale to a financial investor than we would to another private equity group. So there's not as much flipping going on around the club of private equity investors, even though there is more private equity interest in the continent. It is growing. So I would argue that we just fill a need at a particular point in time that then brings in more capital and encourages these other forms of capital from the public markets, financial investors, strategic investors from the Middle East, as Mo's company attested to.
So just to follow up quickly, I mean, we've seen all this talk about the middle class, thanks to the African Development Bank report.
We said the floating middle class.
The floating middle class, quote unquote. But so that brings to mind sectors like telecom, like retail, like financial services. Is that the case, or?
Yeah, so it's really been another trajectory in Africa that I mentioned. The telecom was the very first backbone. The internet telecom, and Mo, I'm sorry, you've heard this 4,000 times, the penetration rate was 2% in Africa when we started investing, when Mo started his company. It grew to 60%. So think of the business that can be done off of the backbone of just basic connectivity. And then you've had the high-speed fiber optic cables connect Africa on both coasts, several of them. And now we're building into the center of the mass of land that Africa represents. We are at the same time delivering some higher end services to the middle class that doesn't have a lot to spend their money on. So, you know, we mentioned Nollywood. We're not investing in Nollywood yet, but we are looking at internet sector for sure. We looked at it a little too early in 2006 with data centers and B2B, and we're glad we didn't do that yet. But we do believe that's a sector for the future. But we have television programming. Africans love to watch TV. We provide pay TV. They love sports. They love to see their own actors and actresses on the TV, as of course anybody would. And then any of these consumer sectors that are related to telecom also need energy. So I mentioned our utility investment. And then we have telecommunications infrastructure. Another way to penetrate the continent is through, you'll see, cellular towers. That's a big new development in Africa in the last 3 to 4 years. You've had thousands of cellular towers will be constructed to bring even greater connectivity, because for every every village that gets a 10% penetration increase in their GDP goes up by 1.6% for the rural village. So it's another driver of growth and backbone. And then some of the other sectors, so that's half of our investment portfolio would be telecom and ICT, and the other half is financial services. The rest is agribusiness. Nigeria, sub-Saharan Africa was not manufacturing its own fertilizer. And they have flared natural gas, which is the main input in Nigeria. So we made an investment in a fertilizer manufacturing and distribution company that now delivers small, domestically produced bags to the small farmer. Millions of cabbages used to be rotting across many farms. It also can do big, huge amounts of fertilizer, and you're no longer importing all of that fertilizer. And then, as I mentioned, we have also, of course, we're looking at the exciting new consumer sectors like soft drinks, bottling. We just did an investment with Pepsi in the north, and I mentioned a repeatable box, Starbucks type chain in the east.
Thank you. Julie, we met a Japanese official last time who was telling us that now in Africa, when he looks for villages, he looks for cell towers. So it was very interesting. So I'm going to move now to more with kind of a irreverent question. Governance. So sometimes governance, it's like aspirin, right? It cures everything. So where do we start? We could find governance problems everywhere. So how do we start? Is the solution maybe connected to all these move about the data revolution, that really Africa needs more data in order to monitor, follow up, and so on, and even for the civil society to really know what's happening? But how do we start? Are there whole low-hanging fruits?
You mean how we start as governments or as civil society or as what?
All of them.
Well, actually, that's a difficult question because education, do you say forget about education, let us do health instead of education, or let us do human rights and forget about economics? You have to do the whole shooting match. That is the job of government. I mean, that's what you need to do. So we think there are 4 pillars for governance. One is security and rule of law. You need to have rule of law, otherwise you don't have society. You need to have rule of law, you have the independent judiciary, etc. Because that's a very important pillar for society. Then you have the economic piece, because you need to build the infrastructure and to manage public finance. The government has to do that. You cannot say, no, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to only do. Then you have human development, education, health, etc. And so anyway, unfortunately, you have to do the whole shooting. And intentionally, when we produce the index, some people said, what about giving some weight to some elements over other elements? And after a long debate, we said, no, we cannot. Because all of these things are needed. And you cannot trade economic development for human rights. You cannot do that. So unfortunately, all of that is needed. I cannot give you, there's no shortcut. The job has to be done.
So difficult job for our policymakers there. So I'm just we might come back for the Q&A, but I'll move to Jason. On Sunday, I was watching this movie, Gravity, with my 7-year-old son, and Sandra Bullock is going from the space shuttle to the Russian space station to the Chinese space station. And my son is like, so where is the Senegalese space station? So why I'm saying that, by the way, South Africa has a agency, space agency, and I think it's very important because when it comes to education, science, technology, engineering, and math, you have to start somewhere. Why am I asking that? It's about the content. So Iroko TV is streaming these movies from Nollywood. By the way, I think that just seeing, even being an African, I'm from Senegal, and seeing what's happening in Nigeria through these movies makes me closer to them, because it's the same feelings. There are people, and I think that when you start understanding that people are people in Africa or everywhere, that's a first step. It's not just a concept. But how about the content? You know, what do you think about a content that is maybe linked to development, to transformation of the economies? Is this an issue you're looking at, or not?
So I think first and foremost, you've got to think of the reality of what people think Nigerians are. I think for the first time in a very, very long time, it's quite cool to be Nigerian. And I think it's the entertainment industry which has sort of supported that. I was in New York at Citibank a couple of months ago, and Nollywood movies are really popular in the Caribbean. So there's a Jamaican sort of bank teller. And she was like, wow, you live in Lagos, like, it's amazing. I said, what do you mean? She says, you know, everyone has got a bigger house and drives around in big cars. I was like, where have you got that from? She said, she watches the movies. But the movies, they don't show, you know, poverty-stricken situations. They show aspiring, fashion, big cars, 4x4s, humongous houses. That is the version of reality which you see from the entertainment industry. And I think, you know, that starts almost with a positive feeling. And when I travel around Africa, there is always quite a positivity towards, especially from young people, towards Nigerians, because we are seen as being quite entrepreneurial, sort of forthright in that. So I think that's a great start to obviously kind of help facilitate business. But again, there is obviously somehow trying to rebalance the reality of Nigeria. Yes, there is situations on the ground, but there are also a lot of other people who are incredibly wealthy. You know, there is a lot of, you know, years ago they used to talk about the brain drain, people leaving Nigeria. But most people that I speak to, especially in New York or in London or wherever they may be, they want to go back to Nigeria. They're just kind of plotting the right opportunity to go back. And that's a question of obviously people on the ground there who are finding opportunities, making opportunities. And, you know, yes, you might have to generate your own electricity, but, you know, you can probably own a 4x4 if you kind of you know, make a few moves, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I think in terms of transforming, and I look at it purely from I consider myself young, I'm 33, but in my company it's 200 people and the average age is 24. So I kind of feel like I'm in a sort of you know, I'm like an 80s baby, they're like. So, no, I think, you know, I think anything which I guess supports and facilitates any type of kind of economic activity amongst young people just has to be somehow encouraged and amplified. I literally don't think that enough of that is actually happening. And I think from my perspective in Nigeria, you know, we have these periodic, I would call them raids, because you see these burly sort of people from the tax or the inland revenue coming to find out what's going on and what are we doing. They don't really care about the business, they don't really understand what we're doing. There's no real regulation around what we're doing because it's almost too small compared to the other kind of easier ways to monetize businesses. So they don't, you know, if you don't understand something, how could you possibly support it? And at the moment, I think there's some really great initiatives around agriculture and One Foundation and all these other great things. But in reality, there will be huge amounts of value created for young people, making young people smarter. And you talked about if you train one person, 3 or 4 families benefit. Imagine if you train tens of thousands of young people. What happens to them, their siblings, who they typically have to train themselves, their own children and their own aspirations? And I think there is nothing being done from my perspective, sitting in Nigeria, about encouraging, amplifying, and really facilitating that kind of economic activity from a 35 and under perspective.
So on this positive note, now we're opening it to questions to the audience. If there are questions from Twitter, I will take them first, but if not, we'll open it. So unfortunately, as Mo said, I don't see very well. So I apologize. Oh, sorry, we have some questions from Twitter. And I'll come back to you in a minute. We have 3 questions from Twitter. The first one to Jason. Do you think internet business can collaborate with nonprofits and NGOs for growth? The second to the panel. Where do nonprofits and NGOs fit in the growth and opportunities story in Africa? So you can maybe put those two as one question. And to Caroline, what does it mean in practice for companies to incorporate governance practices? So let's say there are 2 questions. So one, I guess, is mostly about the role of NGOs and nonprofits, including in the internet business. And the second one is, in practice, what do we do? How do you implement governance practices?
This is the governance of Guru. This.
Yeah.
I'm sure Mo can answer that.
Okay, so let me start. Okay. I think absolutely. I think the more remote, the more widespread, the more difficult it is to engage people one-to-one, the easier it is to kind of use mobile and communication tools to reach huge amounts of people. So if you want to reach 100,000 people in Nigeria, the fastest way to do it literally would just be send a text message to them or pick up the phone and call them. So the more connected the society is, the more you can actually help disseminate information. A couple of years ago, we did we were approached by a Princeton PhD group, and they wanted to measure the propensity for somebody to watch a Nollywood movie and report some type of corruption. So they shot a movie. They edited scenes in there which said, if you saw this police officer harassing or shaking you down for some money, you text this number. And they integrated with like MTN and some of the other telcos and put that in there. They printed 200,000 copies. They distributed them. And they wanted to see what the social sort of impact and how does Nollywood sort of like shape people's behavior. Again, typically, how would you reach people in the Niger Delta if it's not by kind of entertainment? It's the easiest way to reach them. Otherwise, you go one-to-one to go and speak to them. And what they found was that if they watched in a movie that there was some number where you can sort of text and, hey, this person just took my money or something like that, it was a way for them to actually at least engage, but engage on like a wide scale and engage using sort of technology as the backbone to be able to do that. Because one thing Nigeria especially lacks is data. It's like a black hole of data, reliable data. So I think anything which kind of encourages that, and communications definitely do. I think NGOs have to be as smart as possible about how they can reach the most amount of people easiest. And I think just so it's to end on that, I think being in Nigeria over the last 2 weeks with the whole Ebola sort of crisis, every single day there's like a new variation of what's happening. So no more Lagos to Accra flights. It was printed in all the newspapers and all across social media. I left on Saturday morning and there was flights from Accra to Lagos. But in people's minds there wasn't anymore. Apparently, it can be, there was cures from the church, there was cures from cola nuts. So just in disseminating reliable and actual real information, there's still a massive sort of gap there. And these are just basic kind of communicating with people. So I think NGOs can definitely kind of use the internet as probably the most awesome way to kind of reach a lot of people.
Okay, thank you. So it's one thing to measure governance, but it's one thing to actually implement governance. So how do we do that? I think that's the gist of the question. Maybe Mo or Caroline, both of you.
Sure. So it was also asked what we do. When we buy the company, as I mentioned, we then make sure the board is firmly established. All of our procedures, anti-money laundering, anti-bribery, accident reporting, and so forth are put right in to the company. And then it's brought up at every board meeting and at every committee meeting that we have. And then we do random checks of our companies. And when I mentioned the bar was high, our investors actually require us within 24 hours to call some of them if there is any injury, if there is any incident of corruption or any unrest or any misreporting in the news and so forth. So we're very much tied into the news cycle just in relation to our investments overall. And then we have whistleblowing numbers, telephone numbers that our companies have. So what Jason was saying, do we get a lot of reports? It's weird, we do not. But you can, if you're one of our companies or an employee in the company, you have to be able to give an anonymous report about your superior, and a lot of it's cultural change because a lot of junior employees are not used to reporting on the CEO or having the right to do that, so we have to do some training in our companies and so forth. It's a momentous task. I'm not saying it's really easy and you put the paper in place and everybody's acting like governance experts. It's, the culture has to come from the top down and very much the bottom up. But we're seeing that when we change the culture at the top of our companies, it definitely comes up from the bottom. So, and then the misreporting, that's probably a fact of life on every continent now. You could probably ask President Obama how much of that goes on in his life. It's unfortunate. Or President Karuka.
Well, Donna, would you like to add something about this governance question? Or?
In front of Mo Ibrahim, how can I talk about governance? I mean, I just want him to answer. But here's something we should understand, though. In fast-changing societies like ours, it's very important to understand that those forces are sometimes difficult to comprehend. Mm-hmm. For me, at the bank, this is how we define governance. I don't know if Mo will shoot me down today, but that's fine, he's my friend. Number one, is this government a clean government? Mm-hmm. A government which does not steal from its people. That is test number one for us. Mm-hmm. Test number two, is this government able to deliver services to the people? Mm-hmm. Because if you have a clean government which can't deliver services, it is half the job done. Mm-hmm. And third, is this government accountable to its people? So one of those three, this triangle is in place. I'm comfortable with the rest. So I will not ask questions about the form of democratic practice, the kind of parliament they have. Those issues are systems which develop over time. Systems which have developed from the Confucian system, like in Asia, act differently. Those who have come from the Judeo-Christian tradition have the way they interpret governance. So we should not try to have one single definition of governance applying across the world. There are some parameters we all must seek to obtain. This is point number one. Number two, on NGOs. There are some NGOs which I think we should have another conversation with. Each time we're about to do a dam project in Africa, in the bank, to provide electricity to the people, electricity to businesses, small and large companies, it takes a long, long time. From the concept to begin to doing it, giving that 1 megawatt of electricity, it takes 6 years. Because the things you have to go through. Now, we want to do things right, of course. Things are sustainable. But I think there's a conversation we must have with NGOs in that space. Whether it is coal, whether it is hydro dams, whatever it is, we need to have a conversation. Because all these things we're discussing is fine. But until there's that power to drive your Nollywood, to drive your business, there is an issue. So I would like to have more conversation, structured conversation, better conversation, constructive conversation with NGOs in that space for the transformation we're looking for.
No? That's good. Fine. All right, okay. Yeah, we'll open it to Q&A. So I'll take one lady on white there first, and I'll take the gentleman there in the middle, and I'll take one on the right there.
Good afternoon. My name is Barbara Simmons. I'm with William V. S. Tubman University in Liberia. Mr. Ibrahim, I've been quoting ever since I read that you had said that at one point there was this pessimistic view of Africa, and then it became optimistic, and now there needs to be a realistic perspective. I appreciate that. One of the things I would like to know is how can we involve more young people, given the percentage of the population that is young, in terms of entrepreneurship? We require all of our students to take at least 2 courses, regardless of their major, in entrepreneurship. And how can we do more?
Thank you. So, very succinct and short question, and I encourage you to follow this model. So,
Hi, my name is Amadou Daffy. I'm a CEO of a company called U.S Africa. And my question is about outsourcing. A lot of strategies about economic development are being said, but very few moments have I heard people talk about outsourcing in terms of software or even manufacturing. Just on the IT side, $288 billion of IT outsourcing is being generated. Most of it going to Asia. And knowing the youth of Africa, knowing the opportunity that can bring in with influx of money into the continent, and I was just wondering if any of you were thinking about that strategy.
Thank you. And I'll take a third question, the gentleman there behind the column.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Benjamin Timon, Greenberg Trorick. I think a lot of us in this room are familiar with the tremendous resources that multinational private sector companies, funders, and investors are putting towards corruption-focused due diligence, whether that's motivated by concerns over FCPA exposure or similar statutes. There have been some examples over the past year or so of governments taking this more seriously. For example, the privatization unit in Uganda had put out a proposal to vet potential government contractors and investors who want to do business there. Zambia has canceled some contracts where there were allegations of corruption in the awarding of the tender. And I just wondered whether any of you see a trend in greater public sector focus on corruption due diligence.
So we'll stop there to have some answers, and please feel free to pitch in. The first question was about, how do you increase the involvement of the youth, especially in entrepreneurship. The second one was, how about outsourcing? $280 billion of IT outsourcing, and how can Africa get its share of this pie? And the third question is, are governments, African governments, being more serious when it comes to anti-corruption measures, dealing with procurement, for example?
Right. If I start, education. I think we have a problem in education in that most of the curriculum in our schools and universities are really outdated. I was having a conversation, delivering a speech actually to the vice chancellors of the African universities. They had a big meeting in London. And I asked them, when was the last time they sat with some business people to ask them where the future of jobs, what kind of jobs, what kind of economy are we moving to, what kind of training shall we provide? And none did that. None did that. Some basic statistics. 2% of African graduates studied agriculture. 27% studied humanities. Are we gonna build up Africa by Shakespeare and Molière or what?
Or economists.
So really there is a huge mismatch between, and these universities and these schools are publicly funded. It's the money of our people. And people should act responsibly. We need, who designed, the education process in our countries is a bunch of bureaucrats who are completely isolated from the business reality of the world and what's happening out there. And so we need to get that involved of not only business people, other sector of the population in the education process is much too serious to be left to few bureaucrats in the Ministry of Education. And that, as my view, is step number one. We need to prepare the young generation for the future. And that's what we need, and that's what will deal with the issue of outsourcing and other issues. If you don't have the trained workforce for the future, then we have no future. And yes, we have a great advantage here, demographic advantage, because we have more young people than anybody else. You look, the demography of Africa is quite the inverse of the demography in Japan or in Europe. And I mean, I always laughed because somebody mentioned to me the funny example in the London Olympics recently. The oldest competitor was a Japanese, 64 years old, in equestrian competitions. The youngest was a Togolese, 14 years old, young young boy. And that summarizes the demography story of Africa and Japan. Yeah? But yes, we have this huge potential resource at a time when China started to outsource jobs because they are running of workers. Can Africa be the future factory of the world? We cannot unless two things happen. One, we need to prepare our workforce. We need to educate and train our workforce properly. Secondly, very important, is the regional integration of Africa. Because we all sitting here, U.S. Africa meeting, everywhere Africa meeting. But what is Africa exactly? Is Africa a geographical concept? Is it an emotional one? Is it, what is Africa? Africa is 54 countries. Each country has its own regime, its own borders, its own customs, its own laws, its own currency. How can you do business in a fragmented 44 countries in Africa? What is the difference between China and Africa? There's one difference. China is not 54 provinces. That is one difference. If China was 54 countries, each one of them is speaking different language, and you need a passport, you need a visa to go to the other part, and you need that this guy speak Mandarin, this guy speak English, this guy speak Arabic. Where China would have been today would have been in Africa. Would have been Africa. Absolutely. It would have no opportunity, no chance. And unless we pool our resources, unless we create the single market, unless we remove our borders, we have a major problem in the future. We cannot succeed in our own as 54 little countries, everybody trying to find their own little corner. It doesn't work. Then 54 or, well, 50, they did not invite 4 guys. 50 presidents come here. Of course, Obama will not meet anybody of those 50. How can you meet 50 guys? You know? It's ridiculous. Because there is no room in this world for the minor little countries. Unfortunately, you don't have the muscle. I always, you know, it's good. We have more mobile phones in Africa than the whole of the United States. You know that? We have more mobile phones than all of Europe. Did we make one mobile phone in Africa? Why? We don't have the market muscle. None of those 54 countries have the muscle to force Nokia or Ericsson or Apple or whoever, you must put your factory here. In China, you cannot sell a glass of water without technology transfer, without building a factory there. That is the power of the market. And that is what we need to do in Africa. Otherwise, yes, we can move a little bit here, do this, tinker here, tinker that, but we cannot become the real force we deserve to be unless we do that. We need to look at Europe. The greatest achievement of the European Union is the single market. That is the greatest achievement. Even the guys in London who want to get out, they want to stay in the single market because they know it's essential for them, the single market. Without the single market, they are dead. This is the kind of world we have now. So this is the kind of challenges we need to face in the future. And I'm speaking frankly. I hope I'm not upsetting anybody here.
But maybe before we move to the other answers, just a reminder, if you go to the Mo Ibrahim webpage, there's a new report on economic integration in Africa with lots of data, and it's very good. You want to answer the corruption or the outsourcing IT, or it's okay? If not, we move to other questions. Yeah.
So the rise of outsourcing came from an oversupply of local talent. So in India or in China, you know, they could do at a fraction of the cost what anybody can do in US, in Silicon Valley, in New York, or in sort of Boston. So they literally could just do the work. We we've hired about 10 people in the US at $100,000 to $150,000 per person. Like technical talent in New York is super expensive, and it's in great demand. So there's actually a skill discrepancy here in the US. So to find talented like engineers, there aren't that many of them, and they're very expensive. If I could find 20 guys in Nigeria and pay them $100,000, absolutely I'll have them in Nigeria tomorrow. But they're not there. The problem is they're not there. If you look at the school system, it's, at least in Nigeria, it's largely broken. I think it broke back in like the 70s or something. Mo talked about building the right sort of skills for the future. If the skills are not there, then there is no future, or you have to pay for them. So even if you have the money, even if you have the capital, even if you have the investment, you literally have to import people or find some way to actually kind of build that base of individuals. And just to kind of give an indication of what can happen when things do go right, I think it's Obafemi Awolowo University in Ife. About 80% of the internet entrepreneurs I've met in Nigeria today all came from that university. I don't know what they're doing there, but whatever they're doing there, they're doing it literally like about 80% of the internet entrepreneurs that I've met across all companies have come from there. So they were doing something there around technology, around like, sort of future trading of like young people, that they seem to just like really churn out really great individuals. But it's not at the sort of like the hundreds of thousands or like a scale that we basically need to really sort of like build out the smarter economy. So I think, outsourcing ICT is not going to happen anytime soon, especially in places like Nigeria.
So, Caroline?
Yeah, I'm going to say that Mo and Jason have made my day today, because our most recent investment is in education. Really exciting sector going forward. And when you look at the demand, supply, imbalance created by the fact that companies like we create need talent, and we need educated young workers, and we don't want to hurt our bottom line by importing them from abroad. They're very expensive. And then you look at what some countries are doing. They are mandating K through 12 education. That increases even further the demand for a university degree. We just couldn't ignore that demand-supply imbalance anymore. And we thought of it a little bit like we did telecom back in the day of 2% penetration. You can wait around for the government to come up with some brilliant scheme and somehow come up with the brilliant financing for it. Or you could try to compete a little bit with the public schools and do something like what was done in Brazil. If you look at Brazil, they made an amazing strides with education and getting the right skills focus at universities, because from a business perspective, our schools will only succeed if our graduates can find jobs. And they're only going to find jobs if they have skills that are required by the private sector we're all going to try to help grow into the indefinite future. We've only purchased our first 2 universities. It will be a Pan-African platform, but I think it's a sector that's really exciting that you will see grow in the future, like you've seen it in other areas of the world where you just could not meet the demand and the required growth and the required expansion of skill sets without private sector investment. And it's true even at the K through 12 level, probably.
So I just got a note. Unfortunately, I will have to take these are the concluding remarks from our panelists. Again, thank you, panelists.